Hello once again, dear children. As promised, we will be looking at certain questions on chemical coordination. All of these questions come from past year question papers. Just to recap, we looked at this question in the last video, and I just want to go back to state two similarities between hormones and nerves with regard to their functions. What I must remark at this point in time is that very often, whilst the memo might apply to one question, strangely enough, it doesn't apply to another question which is very similar. So my advice to learners is always try and include as much information as you can, especially in explain questions. However, if you look at 1.3, it is just stating two similarities, and I had remarked that both hormones and nerves are stimulated by certain changes in the environment, and they will react or provide a response to that. But the second one that we had to mention is that both these systems work to prevent harm to an organism. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that to you. All right, and once again, one functional difference between hormones and motor nerves. Hormones, the responses are generally slow, and with motor nerves, the responses are quick responses. With hormones, it may affect multiple organs. As you saw with adrenaline, it affects your muscles, your heart, your brain, your breathing muscles. But with motor nerves, the effect is generally localized. For example, it may be just one effector organ. Are you with me? Good. Now let's look at the next question. You'd find that all of these answers you'd be easily able to find if you can remember the mnemonics. Question 2, the endocrine system plays a role in helping a person to cope during a dangerous situation. Of course, immediately what should come to mind is that adrenaline is produced during a dangerous situation. Isn't that so? So name the hormone, it'll be adrenaline. State 3 effects. Can you remember how we remembered those 3 effects? What was the mnemonic? I'm just going to go through the mnemonic with you, my children. And the mnemonic was, he can, you tell me, he can buy goat's milk too. And I said the purpose of adrenaline is to increase the supply of glucose and oxygen to the cells, and each of the roles that it plays will bring about this particular end result that you want, because you want to increase the rate of respiration. So he increases heart rate, increases blood pressure. B increases rate and depth of breathing. G, what is G, my darling? Stimulates the conversion of glycogen to glucose. M, it increases your metabolic rate. T, it increases muscle tone. And C, it constricts blood vessels to your skin and gut. And at the same time, it dilates blood vessels to the skeletal muscles and the heart. Okay, so those are some of the things. Easy when you can remember this with your mnemonic. Okay, let's take this off. Let's go to the next question. We're focusing here. The diagram shows the hormones involved in the homeostatic control of metabolism in the human body. X is a gland found around the larynx, and we know the gland found around the larynx, my darlings. Remember, the larynx is your voice box. Voice box is found in your throat. Of course, that would be your thyroid gland, isn't it so? All right. And of course, you know the relationship between the thyroid gland and that gland there, which is the pituitary. So you know they're talking about the negative feedback mechanism here. Like when there's less of which hormone will be produced by the thyroid gland, watch the arrow, which would indicate the hormone produced by the thyroid gland. So if there's less of which hormone, my darlings? Same hormone there. So it's thyroxine, and then more of that hormone will be released. Isn't that so? We go with that less, more. Isn't that so? So therefore, more of which hormone is released from the pituitary? TSH. And are you able to handle this? Okay. So define the term endocrine gland. Of course, we got the definition of endocrine gland, a gland that releases a secretion directly into the blood. Okay. And which secretion are we looking at? Hormones. Okay. Identify hormone 1. Sorry, are we looking at the right thing? No, we're not, my darling. Identify each of the following: the gland that secretes hormone A. Let's get this right, babies. The gland that secretes hormone A, of course, is the pituitary. The gland that secretes hormone B, coming from this gland, is the thyroid gland. Name the mechanism in the diagram that regulates the level. Of course, it's a mechanism we've been learning about, the negative feedback mechanism. Now, what I've taught learners to do, and what it's very important for each learner to be able to remember, is that you have to read your question very carefully. And at this point, I just want to say to you, one of the mistakes that I see learners make during the reading time in an examination is that they start answering the multiple choice questions. Rule number 1, do not even read your multiple choice questions, because that is short bits of reading that you got to do. You will start by either reading the essay or the questions from section B. Read them carefully, because some of those questions are really wordy. Okay, and you need to get to grips with it. And if you cannot understand what the question is asking of you, my darlings, you will never get the right answer. So please, I implore you, do not start your paper by reading the multiple choice. And what's worse than that is that children will start answering the multiple choice questions. And you're not supposed to have a pencil in your hand during reading time. And I've seen kids addle their brains, and when we say reading time is over, oh, the only thing you have done was read the multiple choice question. So please read section B and section C thoroughly. And when reading time is over, you start off with your multiple choice if you want to, or if you'd like to start off with the essay, that's also an option, as long as you number your questions correctly. Just in case you think you're going to forget your mnemonics or forget your level 1 information that is asked in your essay, you may begin with that. But please do not make the mistake of reading your multiple choice questions and then on top of that trying to find the answers during your reading time. Remember, section A is objective type questions. Most of the questions are just one letter or one word. Rarely you will find something for 2 marks there, where you will have to do an explanation. Now look at 3.3 and read the question carefully. Half of gland X was surgically removed in a person. State 2 possible effects that this would have on the secretion of the hormones referred to in the diagram above. They want the effects only on the secretion of the hormones and not the effect on the body. So please be very careful. So if half of gland X is removed, that's half of the thyroid gland, of course you know, then less thyroxine will be produced. That will be in the first one. But you can't say thyroxine, you say less of hormone B will be released. If you said less thyroxine will be released, it will be wrong, because they didn't ask you to identify, or they did ask you, so it'll be okay, less thyroxine or less hormone B will be secreted from the thyroid gland. And if there's less of this, then remembering your negative feedback mechanism. So if less of thyroxine, how much of the hormone A would be released? Of course, it'll be more of hormone A would be released. Simple like that, 2 marks. Question 4, once again, another negative feedback mechanism, showing the response of an endocrine gland to changes in the amount of glucose. So the minute you talk about the amount of glucose, you're referring to the endocrine gland called pancreas, because the pancreas has the receptors that are sensitive to the levels of glucose in the blood. So you got glucose level when it is too high, detected by an endocrine gland. Glucose level, when it is too low, also detected by an endocrine gland. And in response to this, then if it's too high, it will release a hormone, which will have a specific response. If it is too low, it will release a second hormone, which will also have a specific response. How did we remember the hormones involved with the pancreas? What was the mnemonic that we taught each other, or that I taught you, my darlings? It was PIG, that the pancreas releases insulin and glucagon. Of course, they never released at the same time because they have opposite effects. So my babies, that insulin over there would be hormone 1, because only when it's too high is insulin released. And the response would be you drop your blood glucose levels to normal. And if it's too low, glucagon, that will increase your blood glucose to normal. Of course, you got to know how it is done, isn't it so? Because this is where you stimulate the cells to take up the glucose, and you also stimulate the conversion of glucose to glycogen in the liver and muscle. Here, you stimulate the conversion of glycogen to glucose to raise your blood glucose levels. Let's look at the questions. I actually answered one question already, isn't that so? So let me just get this. There we go, darlings. We're now looking at these questions on this here. It says, define the term endocrine gland. It's a gland that releases hormones directly into the blood. Identify hormone 1, which we did when blood glucose levels are high, insulin. Let me take that pig out just now. And hormone 2 was glucagon. Name the gland that releases. Of course, you know it's pancreas. Explain the consequences for a person if the gland mentioned in question 4.3 fails to release hormone 1. Of course, they're talking about diabetes here. Now, how would the child know whether they wanted an answer totally related to diabetes, or did they want the technical aspects of the hormone insulin? This is why many of our children come out of the exam and say to us, oh, but I knew the answer. But when you look at the memo was focusing only on what that hormone fails, what function will fail to happen if this hormone was not released. So in other words, they're actually asking you about the functions of insulin, but in another way. So explain the consequences for a person if the gland mentioned in 4.3 fails to release hormone 1. So my advice to you would be, say first what hormone 1 does, and now what it wouldn't do, and then say what the consequences would be. Okay, if the consequences would be that the person would become diabetic, now you'll explain why. Are you with me? Explain the consequence. The person will become diabetic. Let's explain why. Can you see it from that way? So the person will become diabetic because hormone 1 will not be able to stimulate the absorption of glucose into cells, and will not be able to stimulate the conversion of glucose to glycogen in the liver and muscles. Therefore, the blood glucose levels will remain high. That is how you do it, baby. So that is why I said, read your question very carefully. They didn't want the consequences of diabetes on the body. They said, explain the consequences for a person if the gland mentioned fails to release hormone 1. The consequence is the person will become diabetic. The explanation is how come the person will become diabetic. So in other words, they're actually testing, do you know the function of insulin? And as I said to you before in previous videos, if they're asking for explain the consequences or predict what will happen, they're actually asking you for the function of something, but in another way. Good. Let me just take this little piggy out and make it go to the market. Okay, good, my darlings. Let's go to question 5. Study the graph below showing the changes in the glucagon concentration during exercise. okay, in the glucagon. Now remember, as you are exercising, you need glucose and you'll use up glucose. You'll use up glucose. And as you're using up glucose, you want more glucose, but you're not eating. Of course, you shouldn't be eating during exercise. You're defeating the purpose of exercise. So you want to know that whilst you're exercising, what would happen to the glucagon level, which will bring you to the underlying fact about this is that the reason why you lose weight when you're exercising strenuously is because you are now converting your stored glycogen to glucose. And stored glycogen adds to your body mass. So if the glycogen is converted to glucose, that is why long periods of exercise makes you lose body mass. And in order for you to convert glycogen to glucose, which hormone must be released? Glucagon. So therefore you see, in the first 5 minutes of your exercise, your glucagon level is increasing, carries on increasing and increased up to the 15th minute excessively. And then from the 15th to 20th minute, there was a gradual increase. And then from the 20th to the 30th minute, it remained constant. Okay. So let's look at the questions based on it. I'm sure they're going to give you a question about what happens to the glucagon level, the way in which they could say, describe the trend in the glucagon level over a period of time, or there you go, describe the trend for the changes in the glucagon level over time. And your answer would be the glucagon levels increased from 100, it was 100 over here. So you use both your axes from 100 to about 200, from 0 to 15 minutes. Are you with me? Or from 100 to 210, I would say. Better still, papas, because it is still increasing. Isn't that so? Because it increased rapidly from 100 to 200, but it also increased gradually from 200 to 210. So we just say it increased from 100 to 210. What is that unit? Picograms per milliliter from 0 to 20 minutes. And then from 20 to 30 minutes, it remained constant, giving you those 3 marks, baby. So always be guided by your mark scheme. Sorry. Always be guided by your mark scheme. Let me just take that off. Okay. Be guided by your mark scheme. 3 marks. Don't just say it increased and then it decreased or remained constant. You must say, use both your axes in the answer. So from then to then, what happened? And be specific when saying, what was the change? Because here you've got specific numbers over here. Okay? So remember that when you are describing the trend. Explain the changes in the level of glucagon from 0 to 10 minutes. Now, they didn't tell you what it did from 0 to 10 minutes. Are you with me? So, you know you have to, that's the first thing you would say. From 0 to 10 minutes, there was an increase in the blood glucagon concentration. Now you're going to explain. That is because glucagon will stimulate the conversion of glycogen to glucose because more glucose is needed for the production of more energy. And this glucose will be used during the increased respiration during exercise. So you got to mention that the glucagon increased. You got to say why it increased. It increased to stimulate the conversion of glycogen to glucose. Now, why do you want glucose? You want more glucose available during exercise because more glucose will support more respiration. And the increased rate of respiration will give you the energy that you need for exercise. So follow the thought right through, my dear children. Follow the thought right through, okay? Remember, be guided by your mark scheme. Taking into account the pattern for glucagon concentration from 0 to 10 in the graph above, what will you expect to happen to the insulin concentration in the same time? Remember, they are opposite. So while glucagon is increasing, you want your insulin to decrease, because if insulin is increasing as glucagon is increasing, insulin will take the glucose out and store it. And you don't want the glucose to be taken out and stored. You want the glucose to be made available for respiration and the production of energy. Lots of questions come about you understanding that during respiration you produce energy. Lots of questions. Explain why people with diabetes mellitus have very little glycogen in the liver and muscles. Are you with me? So diabetes means you got your glucose in your blood and your glucose is not coming out of the blood. And why is that happening? It's because you don't have insulin. So explain why people with diabetes have very little glycogen in, because people with diabetes have a lack of insulin. And therefore, it cannot stimulate the conversion of glucose to glycogen, or it decreases the conversion of glucose to glycogen, because glycogen is only found in the liver and muscles when there's insulin available. So because you have less insulin or defective insulin, you will not have, or will have very little conversion of glucose to glycogen in the liver and muscle cells. Good question, hey? Question 6, once again, diabetes mellitus is usually linked to the body mass index and is calculated as follows. Body mass index is equal to mass over height squared. An investigation was done to determine the relative risk of developing diabetes in females for each body mass index. So if you got a body mass index of less than 20, your risk of developing diabetes is 7.5%. And notice as your body mass is increasing, the relative risk of developing diabetes increases. Draw a histogram. Draw a histogram. Now what I'm going to try and do is to show you the memo for this, and using a new share. Let me just try and get a new share for you. Sorry about that. Yeah. Let me just show you this memo for you to have an idea what a histogram is. And of course, you can get this memo in the form of a document which can be posted to you by your teachers, and you can make a copy of it or have it on your cell phone or on your laptop and be able to access it whenever you want to, because all I'm doing is, here's another histogram for you so you have an idea of what it's going to look like. Okay. Okay, my darlings. So here's your histogram. Let me make it a bit bigger for you. So a histogram has all the bars stuck to each other. Remember, when you're drawing a histogram or a bar graph, make all your bars of the same width. All right. Now, notice there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars you have to draw for just 2 marks. As I was saying to my learners today, if you are being rushed for time, please do not draw the entire graph. You are given 1 mark for the caption, 1 mark for the y-axis label and the unit, 1 mark for the x-axis label and the unit, 1 mark for type of graph. So to draw the type of graph, you must draw at least 2 bars stuck to each other to get type of bar. You can't draw 1 bar, because if you draw 1 bar, you could be drawing a bar graph. Okay, so, and if you draw 2 bars, you'll be getting 1 mark. So of the 6 possible marks, if you're running short of time, if you just draw 2 bars, you'll only lose 1 mark. Be aware of this, because I find students poring over the drawing of a graph for about 20 to 25 minutes. This should take you nothing more than 6 minutes, nothing more than that. And you should time yourself, okay? And you needn't draw all those bars, my darlings, Okay, so a histogram, you can start against the y-axis. All the bars are stuck to each other. Okay, if that's all right, let's go back to a new share and go back to the okay, go back to the question. And whilst we're going back to the question, remember we are on the endocrine system, the chemical coordination system, my darling. And we've answered all those questions. Yeah, draw a histogram. Let me just make this a little bigger for you, darlings. Okay. So draw a histogram. And we went through is name the hormone that results in diarrhea when it is deficient. Of course, that's insulin. Name the organ that secretes it. Don't you wish for questions like this? Pancreas. Say 2 other hormones, except the one mentioned, that influence the glucose level of the blood. So pancreas, the insulin influences the glucose level of the blood. And of course, the other 2 hormones that you learned about is glucagon, which stimulates the conversion of glycogen to glucose, adrenaline that stimulates the conversion of glycogen to glucose, and many texts also mention thyroxine. But glucagon and adrenaline is enough for now. Let's go to the last question, which is an essay question on this here. What an easy question, darlings. Name and state the functions of 4 hormones secreted by the pituitary gland in humans. Of course, those 4 hormones are, how did you remember that? 4 H's and a P, TSH, GH, LH, FSH. You got to name them, so 4 marks are given for the names. Are you with me? And then you got to state the function. State as many as you can because you don't know how they're dividing their marks. And when it comes to essays, you have no idea how many marks are given to each part of the essay. So write as much as you want, but please write below a subheading. And the second part of the essay, describe how the pituitary gland controls the functioning of the thyroid gland using negative feedback. My goodness, don't you just love something like this, babies? It is such an easy question. Such an easy question. Level 1 question. And I'm just going to show you the memo to that question. See, there we go. Hormones secreted by the pituitary gland. Notice they gave one function each. Of course, growth hormone, if you cannot see it, darling. Growth hormone stimulates the growth of the long bones or the skeleton and the muscles. They got skeletal muscles. Are you with me? So long bones and the skeletal muscles, I would say. FSH stimulates follicle development in the ovaries of the females. LH stimulates ovulation or stimulates the formation of corpus luteum from the burst Graafian follicle in the ovaries. TSH regulates the growth of the thyroid gland, or I would say regulates the secretion of thyroxine. Prolactin stimulates the production of milk. Now, I have no idea why they have ADH here, because ADH is produced by the hypothalamus. ADH is actually stored in the pituitary. It doesn't produce it. So technically ADH should not be here. I think the reason why they got ADH here is because when ADH is needed, it is merely released from the pituitary, but it is not produced by the pituitary. Please know that for a physiological fact that ADH is produced by the hypothalamus and stored in the pituitary. So when it is needed, it is just released from the pituitary. It's almost like that relationship between the liver and the gallbladder. Gallbladder releases bile, but it doesn't store bile, okay? So that you want the pituitary control of thyroid function. Now notice here, darlings, they spoke when the thyroxine levels decreases and when the thyroxine levels increases. Here you had a maximum of 8 and here you got a maximum of 9. But you didn't know that. Now many of the children would have only said like, you know, when the thyroxine levels in the blood is low, then the pituitary gland is stimulated to secrete more TSH. TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete more thyroxine and so on. And they would have left out the second part. So once again, my advice holds. Write as much as you know, my children, when it comes to, there we go, when it comes to an essay question. Good. Now let's look at the homeostasis part of it. Once again, this is to do with your negative feedback mechanism. Notice these questions are not very searching, isn't that so? Not very searching at all. Thus, it is so important for you to have full knowledge of this, and you're bound to get your marks. The minute you see liver, pancreas, you know the hormones are insulin and glucagon by now, isn't it so? High levels of glucose, and this one will be stimulated to release insulin. Low levels of glucose, this would be glucagon. Okay, and what would happen if insulin is released? The glucose is converted to glycogen. Are you with me? And it will decrease the blood glucose level. And here your glycogen is converted to glucose, which will increase your blood glucose level. Identify organ 1. Oh, you'd love this. Pancreas. Hormone 2, insulin, because you know it decreases blood glucose as well if you're confused. Hormone 3, I don't want to look at it, glucagon. The disorder caused when organ 1 fails to release sufficient amounts of hormone 2, diabetes. The mechanism that controls, oh my God, negative feedback, okay? Next one. Describe the homeostatic control of blood glucose levels in a person who consumed a large amount of sugar. If you consumed a large amount of sugar, the first thing you're going to say is, number one, you got to say, and don't assume this, you got to say that the blood glucose levels will rise with a large amount of sugar that the person has taken in. Then the pancreas is stimulated to now secrete insulin into the blood, which travels to the liver or the muscles and stimulates the conversion of excess glucose into glycogen, which decreases the blood glucose levels to normal, or which also stimulates the absorption of glucose by the cells, dropping your blood glucose levels. Actually, they're asking the function of insulin. Question 3. An investigation was carried out to determine the influence of alcohol in the volume of urine produced. If you remember the first lesson that I gave to you on chemical coordination, I said to you that alcohol has a way of depressing the ADH production. So less ADH is produced when you drink alcohol. And if there's less ADH, your collecting tubules become less permeable to water, less water moves out, and less water is absorbed into the blood, and more water passes out in your urine. Are you with me? That is why when people have a hangover after drinking lots of alcohol, the best way to recover from a hangover is not to drink beer. No, the best way to recover from a hangover is to drink lots and lots of fluid. Once again, that fluid should not be beer. 12 healthy 23-year-old males of similar height and mass, all of this here, 23 is also controlling the age that you are using, the age. So all of them were 23 years. All of them were males. All of them were a similar height. All of them were similar mass. This all speaks to the investigation being valid. That is how the investigator ensured that the investigation was valid. 12 is not a cute sample, isn't that so? Healthy would also speak to validity, okay? But 12 is not a big sample. In fact, to make this more reliable, you've got to use a large sample. In other words, many individuals should have participated, okay? But let's see. The investigation was conducted as follows. The men were divided into 2 groups. Now, whenever you divide into 2 groups, one serves as a control to actually verify that the difference in results was due to that one thing that was different and nothing else. You got to prove that. So everything would be identical between A and B, except for the one factor that you're investigating. What would be the factor? If you look here, my darlings, the investigation was carried out to determine the influence of alcohol. So alcohol, whether you drank it or you didn't drink it, would be the independent variable. The volume of urine produced is the dependent variable. So whenever they have the statement, an investigation was carried out to determine this, you can work out the independent and dependent variable from that statement. Always the independent variable would be the one thing that is changed. And the dependent variable is how you can measure or see what change that effect had, and what effect, that change had. So for example, a simple statement like this, if I had to write out a simple statement just to check if you know what I'm talking about. If I say I wanted to see the effect of temperature on photosynthesis, on the rate of photosynthesis, let's put on that, on rate of photosynthesis, okay? I wanted to check the effect of temperature on the rate of photosynthesis. The investigation was carried out for that. So whatever you want to see the effect of, whatever you want to see the effect of, my darlings, that becomes the independent variable. I wanted to see the effect of temperature. So temperature becomes the one factor that I change. What is it changing? What am I going to measure is the rate of photosynthesis. So rate of photosynthesis becomes my dependent variable. Would you remember this? You can work out the independent and dependent. Now, sometimes rate of photosynthesis is such an abstract thing, you know. That is the dependent variable, but you can't measure it. So therefore, they will say to you sometimes, which is the dependent variable and how was it measured? Maybe it was measured using the number of bubbles given off by a plant, or it was measured by checking the change in mass in the plant, because as they produce more starch, the mass would increase. Is that okay? So very important, my darlings, to bear in mind that when you're reading a question like this, you can work out the independent and the dependent variable. You can even work out what factors which will ensure that the investigation was valid. The investigation was conducted as follows: 2 groups of 6 each. So 6 each, once again, is validity. You didn't put 8 in one and 4 in the other. The 2 groups ate the same food, once again validity, and did the same exercise, once again validity, for the 24-hour period of before testing. Each group was given the following to drink before the 24-hour period. Group A was given 1 liter of alcohol-free beer. That is beer that does not contain alcohol. And you would have learned from our earlier thing on nervous coordination, you don't tell them what they're drinking. Because if you do tell them, it will influence their performance, thus rendering your investigation not valid. Do we understand that? And 1 liter of alcoholic beer. Urine was collected from each man every hour. Okay, and then they will calculate the average. So there were 6 men in group A, 6 men in group B. So just in case after the first hour, they collected urine from all 6 men in group A and worked out the average. Just in case in group A, the first man produced 600 mil, second man produced 500 mil. Let's do this together so you know how an average is calculated, okay? So if in group A, the first man produced 500 mils. The second man, 450 mils. The third man, 510. The fourth man, 480, okay? The fifth man, 515. The sixth man, 485. To calculate the average, you would add up all of these here. So that is, we're going to try and add here, isn't that? So 5, 10, Nord carry 1, 6, 7, 15, 16, 24, 6, 11, 15, 20, 25, 29. So 2940 would be my total. Now, how do I work out the average? I divide that now by how many participants that I had. How many participants did I have here, darlings? I'm trying to find the division sign here. I am too good with these things. I just do that there, but that's minus. Where's the division sign? Goodness me, just play with me and say that's division by 6. And if I do that there, 6 into 29, oh my God, it's 4, 24, 54, 9. So I come up with my answer, 650. Can never be 650, 550, sorry. 6 there we divided by 6, 6 into 450, sorry. 6 into 29 is 4, so 450 is my average, okay? Is equal to 450. So that will be my average, and that is how they calculate the average. So another way in which they ensure reliability is calculating the average volume or average reading. And average reading is more reliable than taking one reading. This was just a technical issue because sometimes they ask you to calculate average in certain questions. So average, you take all the numbers and divide by how many participants or how many test tubes there were, etc. Okay, so let's erase all of that there. So let's go and see what happens after that. Assume the volume of urine collected is equal to the volume of urine produced. So after 1 hour, 599, 413, 112. So as they exercised, my darling, not as they exercise, assume that the volume of urine they collected, what did they do, papas? Each group was given the following to drink after the 24-hour period, and then they calculated the urine. So with the first one, 599, 413, you actually have volume of urine dropped here. In group B, the volume of urine also dropped, but not as much as group A. You notice that? Okay, it also dropped, but not as much as group A. Okay. State the dependent variable. You can even predict these questions after a while, my children. You can even predict these questions after a while. So state the dependent variable. Now, dependent variable will be the volume of urine. The volume of urine. By the way, what is the independent variable? Normally, we teach the children what is on the left-hand side is the independent, what is on the right-hand side is the dependent. Would you say time of collection is the independent variable? Never, because that is just the time you collected it. It's almost like saying, as I said to you in the last video, if I had here test tube and I had test tube 1, test tube 2, test tube 3, and you tell me test tube was the independent variable, that makes no sense. Are you with me? So what is the independent variable is the type of liquid that they had to drink. One was an alcohol-free beer, the other was an alcoholic beer. Are you with me? But they didn't ask you that question, but that would be the independent variable. 2 planning steps the investigators had to take before the investigation started. Now, there was some indication that they're not going to be testing you too much on planning things. But of course, you got to do the following. You got to decide on how many participants you are using. You got to get permission from these participants, very importantly. You can't subject them to something without asking their permission. You decide how to record your information. Are you going to use a table? Are you going to do a graph? You collect all the apparatus that you're going to be using, you know, and you decide when you're going to do this. It's like, you know, deciding when you're going to have a party, what you're going to plan, that type of thing. 2 factors that need to remain constant other than the ones that were mentioned. Now, the ones that were mentioned that they were all 23-year-old, they were all males, etc. What 2 other factors, of course, almost always under the 2 factors, one of the things that will come up, there must be the same environmental conditions, like, and especially the same temperature. And the other one that you'll always talk about, use the same investigator. Don't change the investigator. The same investigator must be taking the readings. And the third one is that make sure they don't have any other fluid besides that 1 liter of alcoholic free beer that you're given. Because if you're having more fluid, then more urine will be produced. Okay. And when you gave them that exercise, made sure that the exercise was identical to the two groups. 2 steps that the investigator took to ensure the reliability. What did he take? This answer you'll give in the past tense. What did he do? He used a large sample, which we don't quite agree with, but you'll say he used a large sample. And he collected or he recorded the average volume of urine. Those are the only 2 things there. Because reliability speaks about samples. How large is a sample? Reliability speaks about getting an average reading. Based on the results, explain how the intake of alcohol influences the secretion of ADH and consequently the volume of urine. So group A had the alcohol, isn't it? So my darlings, group A, no, group A didn't have the alcohol, but group B had the alcohol. Okay, and you find that the huge volume of urine was produced in group B compared to group A. And then the second time, more voluminous urine was produced in group B compared to group A. And in third time, more was collected. So every time, more urine was collected. Now, the only time more urine will be collected is when more urine comes out no water comes out in your urine. And how come there will be more water in your urine? Because the alcohol would have suppressed the secretion of ADH. And if it suppressed the secretion of ADH, less ADH causes the collecting tubules to become less permeable to water. Less water is reabsorbed back into your blood and more water passes out in the urine. Thus, you produce a large volume of urine. Okay, my darlings? I just want to skip some questions here and there, and hopefully you would be able to catch up with those answers at some time or the other. Okay, just to wrap up the section here, let's look at this question here, my darling. That is the last question. The table below shows how body temperature is regulated by hypothalamus. Now, that's one thing about your homeostasis that I failed to do because I wanted to discuss it under this question. And what I'm going to do is to show you a comparative table about what happens on a cold and a hot day. What happens on a cold and a hot day. So whatever happens on a hot day, the opposite would be, it would be opposite, to whatever happens on a cold day. So once again, if you know one, you know the other. Okay. Sorry about my not so straight lines. Okay. And before we begin with this here, so let's go and say what happens on a hot day and what happens on a cold day. So hot day, and there, my children, what happens on a cold day. You would know from your own bodies what would be the difference, but what we need to know is what actually happens. Now, the part of the body that is involved in the control of the body temperature are 2 parts. First, your skin for detecting the change in the temperature outside, and then it is which part of the brain that controls your body temperature? Hypothalamus. So it's the relationship between skin and hypothalamus. Okay, so first, when it comes to hot weather, when your body is exposed to higher temperature, heat receptors in the skin are stimulated. And you know, when heat receptors are stimulated, impulses are created, and these impulses will go right up to the hypothalamus. Okay, and the hypothalamus in turn now will respond by sending impulses down to which part of the skin, it will send impulses down to the blood vessels and causing the blood vessels to now dilate. So your blood vessels get wider than normal. Now this dilation of the blood vessels will produce two consequences. Sorry, my darling. This dilation will produce two consequences. So the blood vessels are now wider than they normally are. They are now dilated. So that means more blood is sent to the surface of the skin. That is why people who are light skinned, surface of the skin, they look absolutely pink or red on a hot day, because there's more blood gushing to the surface of the skin because the blood vessels in the skin are now dilating. The blood vessels in the skin are now dilating. Are you with me? So blood vessels dilate, more blood is sent to the surface of the skin for what? So that more heat will be lost from the surface of the skin by radiation. I'm not writing all of that, but please understand, more heat will be lost from the surface of the skin by radiation. So that's one consequence of the blood dilating. The other consequence would be as follows. In your skin, you have sweat glands. So if there's more blood coming to your surface of the skin, more blood is also sent to the sweat glands, is sent to the sweat glands. And if more blood is sent to the sweat glands, follow that thought through. More sweat is produced, and there will be more evaporation of sweat, leading to the drop in the temperature of the blood. So it's just not producing lots of sweat, it is the evaporation of the sweat, my darlings, that will now bring down the blood temperature by increasing the amount of heat that is lost from the body. That is what happens. Now, sometimes you're asked to write this in a little essay as well, in a part of the essay, okay? So with cold weather, cold receptors in the skin are stimulated, impulses are created, taken to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will now send down impulses to the blood vessels, causing them to do what? Opposite of dilate would be constrict. So if they constrict, less blood is sent to the surface of the skin, less heat is lost to the outside by radiation. Less blood is sent to the sweat glands, less sweat is produced, less evaporation of sweat, thus there'll be less cooling of the blood. Also on a cold day, my darlings, an additional thing that you have to write about here is that on a cold day, your thyroxine levels increase, your thyroxine levels are increased, and that is to increase your metabolic rate and your rate of respiration, because during respiration, you will produce heat. That is why the thyroxine levels are increased on a cold day, to increase the rate of respiration and the production of heat, to raise your body temperature to normal. Good. So that is the theory. Let's look at this last question here then, my darlings. The table below shows how body temperature is regulated by the hypothalamus by influencing heat production and heat loss. The body temperature is 36.4. Heat production is 320. Now you must know 36.4 is way below your normal. Let's take your normal to be 37. 37 degrees. So that's way below, and notice how much of heat is produced and so less heat loss. 36.6, heat is produced, but not as much as the colder temperature. Heat is produced, but not as much as that. Here, the amount of heat produced is equal to the amount of heat lost. 36.9. So they're taking 36.9 to be your norm here, my darlings. Isn't that so? So 37, 90 heat produced and 100 is lost. So that means you needed to lose some heat at 37. You needed to lose some heat at 37. That is why you lost something. You lost more than you gained. 37.2, of course, you lost more, Are the blood vessels that supply the blood to the skin constricted or dilated at 36.4? Here, you're losing less blood and only less heat, my darlings. I hope I didn't use the word blood. Here, of course, your blood vessels will be constricted, cold. Explain the advantage of the diameter of the blood vessels, constricted or dilated, in question 5.1. Actually, they want to ask what happens on a cold day, my darlings. Now, some children say, oh my God, the advantage, what am I going to put? Papas, they're just asking you to write about what happens on a cold day. So if they are constricted, you would say less blood will flow to the skin. So there'll be less heat lost to the environment by radiation. First part, 2 marks. Less sweat will be formed because less blood goes to the sweat gland. There will be less evaporation of sweat, and therefore there will be less cooling of the blood, or here they say skin, and body heat will therefore be conserved. So they ended up by saying body heat is conserved. 5.3, heat loss is the greatest at 37.4 degrees. Explain how the body is able to increase heat loss. They just want to know what happens on a hot day. 5.2, they just want to know what happened on a cold day. 5.3, what happens on a hot day. Now, you must know that they changed the wording to move this from a level 1 question to a higher level question, to satisfy the levels of questioning that we need in a paper. But somehow the kids get so confused, they think that the examiner is asking about something difficult. The examiner is not asking about something difficult. He is just changing the wording, but asking the same thing. 5.2, they're asking what happens on a cold day. But if they ask what happens on a cold day, it'll become a level 1 question. 5.3 is asking what happens on a hot day. Once again, they're changing the level of the question, but asking you something that you have learned. So explain how the body is able to increase heat loss. Hypothalamus is stimulated, sends message to the blood vessels of the skin to dilate. More blood flows to the surface of the skin. More heat is lost by radiation from the surface of the skin. More blood will flow to the sweat glands. More sweat is produced. More evaporation of sweat, causing heat loss from the body. I do hope that you have a great insight into the chemical coordination and homeostasis, and this has been of great help to you. Until I see you again, God bless you and continue studying.